Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Worship in the Home. Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you've enjoyed the service so far and felt able to join in with all that we've been doing together in terms of our worship and prayers. We come now to our Bible reading, which today is from John 12, and I'm reading from verses 1 through to 11. Headed up, Jesus anointed at Bethany. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honour. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about 1/2 litre of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bags, he used to help himself to what was put into them. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you'll not always have me. Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came, not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. For on account of him, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and believing in him. May God bless that passage to us as we think about it together. I thought of beginning this talk by showing you a video of myself fluffing some notes as I played a very difficult solo on the guitar. But then I decided against it because, well, probably would look too deliberate. But it wouldn't have been difficult because the fact is I don't play the guitar as well as I used to. And there are two main reasons for that. The first is that at 63 and 3/4, my fingers aren't as agile as they used to be. They're not as nimble over the fretboard as they used to be. And the other, far more significant factor is that, well, there's just an almost total lack of practice these days. And very little playing either. So I won't be playing the William Tell Overture anytime soon. Not that I could ever play the whole thing, of course, but anyway, if you want to hear someone who could, on a 12th string no less, look up Glenn Campbell, William Tell Overture, standing ovation on YouTube. It's phenomenal. But yes, I haven't played a great deal for the last year, and so I'm very out of practice. I've neglected the disciplines, you see, repeated scales with my left hand and picking exercises with my right hand. I know what my right hand's got to do, and I know where my left hand's got to go, but I can't go fast enough because, well, I haven't practiced the basic disciplines that would have kept me up to speed. To put it another way, I haven't kept myself musically fit, and I'm living to occasionally regret it. Ever since it became apparent that the corona outbreak was going to deeply affect us all for some time, I've had this growing feeling that one of the biggest factors in our survival as believers will be the extent to which we personally practice the essential spiritual disciplines. In other words, the degree to which we exercise our spirits. In a book called Disciplines of a Godly Man, long-time pastor and prolific author Kent Hughes has this to say: we will never get anywhere in life without discipline, be it in the arts, business, athletics, or academics. This is doubly so in spiritual matters. In other areas, we may be able to claim some innate advantage, he says. An athlete may be born with a strong body, a musician with perfect pitch, an artist with an eye for perspective, but none of us can claim an innate spiritual advantage. In reality, we're all equally disadvantaged. None of us naturally seeks after God, he says. None of us is inherently righteous. None intrinsically does good. Therefore, as children of grace, our spiritual discipline is everything. I repeat, he added, spiritual discipline is everything. So imagine my surprise and delight when I noticed that 3 of the most significant spiritual disciplines were alluded to in our passage for today, which is part of a series actually that was planned months ago. By the way, we did consider pausing this John series in order to look at something of more immediate relevance, but I'm so glad we didn't, because today's passage could not be more relevant given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Exceptional situation. Just one more thing to add before we start, and it has to do with the word discipline, as in spiritual disciplines. The first definition that my computer offered me for this word was the practice of training people to obey rules and a code of behaviour, using punishment to correct disobedience. Listen very carefully. This is not the definition of a spiritual discipline, obeying rules or using punishment. So please don't stop the video because we're looking at things I'm calling disciplines. Because another definition of discipline is an activity that provides mental or physical training, or in our case, spiritual training. Here's Christian author Donald Whitney, who's written a book about the spiritual disciplines. He says, they are those personal and corporate disciplines that promote spiritual growth. They are the habits of devotion and experiential Christianity that have been practiced by the people of God since biblical times. Indeed, Jerry Bridges, who for many years worked with a discipleship ministry called the Navigators, said this: spiritual disciplines are provided for our good, not for our bondage. They are privileges to be used and not duties to be performed. So please banish any thoughts of legalism. Would you think it legalistic to tell your child to clean his teeth or eat her greens or do his homework? Of course not. And neither is practicing spiritual disciplines a form of legalism. On the contrary, actually, for if they're prayerfully and joyfully undertaken, they will help you find a new level of freedom and godliness and abundant living. And those things bring even greater joy in their wake. So that's what we're looking at. 3 spiritual disciplines that will help us to spiritually flourish, even at such a difficult time as this. We find the first of them at the end of verse 2, which says, Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. So here then is Lazarus fellowshipping with Jesus. Just imagine that. Reclining at a table with Jesus. The one who just a short time before had restored your buried corpse to life. What a stupendous privilege to dine with the one that everyone's talking about, to share a table with the life-giving Lord. How amazing. But hang on a minute. What did the risen and glorified Jesus say to the tepid church at Laodicea? Many of you will know this by heart. Here's Revelation 3:20. Here I am, says Jesus. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and what? Eat with him and he with me. We have to remember that actually that was not so much an invitation to those who'd never met Jesus, but to those who were already believers and yet had somehow shut Jesus out. Love the way Mark describes the calling of the 12 in chapter 3 and verse 12. Jesus went up on a mountainside, he said, and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, here it is, that they might be with him. You see, astounding as it may seem, that's actually what the Lord Jesus wants. He wants to connect with us. He wants to do life with us. He wants just to be with us. And yet how often we ignore such opportunities, or we fail to plan them into our daily schedules or to-do lists. Now, I'm generalizing, of course. I'm saying we, to include myself. But I've no doubts at all that this is one spiritual discipline that some of you really excel at. Spending time with Jesus. Sitting at his feet. Listening as well as speaking. Just being in his presence with no other agenda than to be with him. Some of you treasure times like that. Look forward to them. But for those of us who are easily distracted, who find it hard to be inactive for more than a few minutes, such patient sitting and waiting, very hard to do. We marvel at the hymn writer who wrote of the pure delight of a single hour that before thy throne I spend, when I kneel in prayer and with thee, my God, commune as friend with friend. But we rarely pass the 10-minute barrier without really, really struggling when we've tried that sort of thing for ourselves. However, I've been slowly learning that Jesus enjoys walking every bit as much as he likes sitting or reclining. That what matters to Jesus is not so much the where and the how, but the why and the how often. That the Lord is happy to meet us at a bird reserve or in a workshop or even in a gym, as happy as he is meeting up in a room somewhere in your home. Are you with me? Doesn't matter where. The Lord has been reminding me yet again that fellowship with him is absolutely vital to my spiritual well-being. That simply being deliberately and consciously with him is something I dare not neglect if I want to stay spiritually healthy. Where that happens is neither here nor there, because it can be pretty much anywhere. It's the frequency of our fellowship that's far more significant. Being with Jesus, fellowshipping with him. We shouldn't be surprised at our spiritual frailty if we don't make time to be alone with Jesus. Neither should we wonder at our lack of Christ-likeness if we don't give time to be in his presence. Theologian and pastor Kevin DeYoung put it this way: if you want to be Christ-like, you need to have communion with Christ. That's the first of the three essential spiritual disciplines that I found in this reading from John 12. Here's the second: Mary worshipping Jesus. Verse 3 says, Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume, and she poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. I have a Bible app on my computer called Logos, which of course means the Word of God. I just happen to have the basic edition, but even that one comes with several different versions of the Bible, a super fast concordance, a Bible dictionary, number of commentaries, book of word studies, and an excellent collection of maps. It's amazing. Just hover over a little word with your mouse and the original Greek term pops up on your screen, and then it links up with a lexicon. It's wonderful. But one thing it doesn't do with regard to this scene in John 12, one thing that even a Mac can't reproduce, it's the smell of the room. In fact, there's very little point me trying to say to you, well, imagine the smell, because most of us wouldn't have a clue as to what pure nard smelled like. What we could really do with is a scratch and sniff card. Remember those? But there are a couple of things we should notice about this lovely act of devotion that I think would challenge us with regard to the reality and the depth of our own worship. Firstly, John says it was an expensive perfume. My Logos app tells me that nard is an oil that comes from the root and the spike of the nard plant, which is why sometimes it's called spikenard. William Hendrickson adds that nard is an aromatic herb grown in the high pasture land of the Himalayas between Tibet and India. And he goes on to say, in view of the fact that it has to be procured in a region that is so remote and carried on camelback through miles and miles of mountain passes, it was very highly priced. You'll notice that Judas objected to the extravagance of Mary's act, saying it was worth a year's wages. Larry Richards suggests that because of its value, perfume was often purchased as an investment and kept for a rainy day or even a wedding. So the nard that Mary poured over Jesus' feet may well have been representing her life savings. And there it was, gone, running all over the floor. She could hardly gather it up and use it again. And Mark adds a detail that Matthew and John leave out in their accounts, telling us that Mary even broke the jar. What a costly thing that was to do. What an extravagant demonstration of devotion, a sacrificial act of love. I have to say that whenever I read this story, I'm challenged afresh with respect to my own personal worship. Mary's unfailing act, an unstinting act of devotion, suggests to me that my worship should at least on occasions be both costly and extravagant. Back in the day when I was a good bit younger, we'd sometimes sing very joyfully and heartily, "We bring the sacrifice of praise into the house of the Lord." But what sacrifice? Does our worship ever demand such sacrifice? Does it ever really cost us anything? Well, actually, yes, it should. Psalm 51 and verse 17 says this: "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart." Just as Mary was prepared to break that delicate alabaster box, so we must be prepared to be broken. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be broken? Well, my mind went back to those old cowboy series like The High Chaparral that we used to watch in black and white on my parents' television. Now I really am showing my 63 3/4 years. One of the things that cowboys used to have to do quite regularly, it seemed, was break horses. And in that context, the words break and broken have to do with the will, the horse's will. The cowboy broke a horse in order to bring it under his control, so that his mount would go where he wanted to go, at a pace that he wanted to travel. Do you remember what Paul said in Romans 12, in the first couple of verses? Here's how the New Living Translation puts it: "Dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God, because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable." Here it is. This is truly the way to worship him. Don't copy the behaviour and customs of this world, says Paul, but let God transform you into a new person. Notice this: by changing the way you think. And then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So when we bring our songs to the Lord, do we bring our whole selves as well? Because that's what he wants. And that's costly. That's a real sacrifice of praise. There's a lovely song about what Mary did in John 12. It's called "Broken and Spilled Out." And the refrain of that song goes like this: "Broken and spilled out, just for love of you, Jesus. My most precious treasure lavished on you. Broken and spilled out and poured at your feet in sweet abandon. Let me be spilled out and used up for you." So I have to ask myself today, is my worship costly? Is it in any way sacrificial? Am I ready to be broken and spilled out and used up for him? Bruce Milne comments, Jesus merits the richest treasures of our self-giving. Absolutely. That's the first challenge that Mary's act presents to our worship. The second comes out in the second half of verse 3, where John says, "She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume." I want you to try and picture that scene if you can. The guests are reclining at the foot-high table, enjoying the dinner. The room smells a little bit like the inside of a Greek restaurant, filled with the aroma of herbs and spices and meats cooking and everything like that. And everyone's happy and the party's going well, when all of a sudden there's this beautiful fragrance overpowering the smell of the olives and the cumin. Not one of your cheap Korean imitations. This is pure spikenard and it's heavenly. Where's it coming from? And then you notice there's a woman at Jesus' feet and she's wiping them with her hair. Let's face it, that was, to say the least, a potentially embarrassing thing to do. Everyone's eyes would have been eventually fastened on Mary. She'd unbound her hair, and no respectable woman ever did that in public. Tom Wright comments that's roughly the equivalent of a modern polite dinner party of a woman hitching up a long skirt to the top of her thighs. But I'd like to suggest that as far as Mary was concerned, she wasn't in public. She was in her own little bubble. And the only person who really mattered to her at that moment was Jesus. She loved him. She had much to thank him for. She wanted to pour out her heart to him in devotion. This was an intimate moment just between her and her Lord, and she didn't care a shekel what other people thought about it. What an example she is. What a challenge to me and to you. For surely our worship, like Mary, should be made up of selfless acts of love. That when we worship God, be it alone or together, our first thought, indeed our only thought, should be for him and not for ourselves. That if the Holy Spirit leads us to reach out our hands to God in worship, to raise them up in his honour, to lift them as an acknowledgement of his greatness, we do it. And if we're the only one in the room with our hands raised, we shouldn't even notice it because we're so absorbed with God, we're so taken up with him that we're blissfully unaware, as I'm sure Mary was, of what anyone else is doing or even thinking. Perhaps one of our problems is we want to be dignified in worship. We're not prepared to be humbled. But can you tell me what's dignified about what Mary did? Kneeling on the floor, wiping Jesus' feet with her hair. I'm sure some of the guests were squirming in their seats with embarrassment. What on earth does she think she's doing? And yet, what does Jesus say? Matthew 26, verse 10. She has done a beautiful thing to me. And wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. May the Lord set us free from our self-consciousness in our worship. May he bring us to the point at which our only concern is him and his glory. That's the second of our essential spiritual disciplines, worship. Being abandoned to God in love and devotion. Now for the third and the last one, and I'll be very brief with this. Martha serving Jesus. Just 2 words. Verse 2, Martha served. You may remember that on another occasion, Martha complained to the Lord that her sister was just sitting at his feet, leaving her to do all the work. And Jesus said, Mary has chosen what is right. Is that what he said? No. What he actually said was, Mary has chosen what is better. Worship is better than work in the sense that it should take priority over it. But service should be a consequence of worship. It should flow out of our worship. If we love the Lord, we'll not only want to worship him and exalt him, but we'll also want to do things for him. We want to serve him in some way or another. And how can we do that? Especially now, during this period of lockdown. How can we actively serve the Lord? Well, Martha waited on tables. When Jesus came to her house, she made sure the place was clean and comfortable and gave him something to eat, something to drink. Martha's was a practical sort of service. She washed dishes, she beat the carpet, she kept the place tidy. Maybe that's the sort of thing you're good at. You're a practical person. You're good with the hands, so why not use your hands to serve the Lord? It's not easy right now, just at this point in time, but I'm sure that some of you have already volunteered to help with the NHS, what they're doing, or assist with our own pastoral care work here at the church, and some of you I'm sure will be going out and helping needy neighbours in any way that you can. And if that's you, remember Jesus' words in Matthew 25 verse 40, where the king says, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of these, the least of my brothers and sisters, you did for me." But then again, maybe you're more like me. The only walls that you can build are those made of Lego bricks. So you use your head to serve the Lord, or your ears, or your feet, or your mouth. And the possibilities are endless. Make sure you do something. Particularly as many of you are going to have a lot more time on your hands for the next few weeks, or even months. According to an article on the BBC's website, British gymnast Max Wilcox says He's been training in his garden to keep his Olympic preparations on track, following the postponement of the Tokyo Games. Whitlock, who won 2 golds in Rio, has a pommel horse in his garden. I think you just have to be creative with what you've got at home, he told BBC Breakfast. Keep fit, keep active, and keep the structure of life as much as possible. Now, as well as other disciplines, vital disciplines like daily prayer and Bible readings, the 3 that we've looked at, fellowship with God, the worship of God, and service for God, ought to be part of that structure of life for the follower of Jesus. Phillips Brooks, who wrote O Little Town of Bethlehem, put it very succinctly when he said this: we will never become truly spiritual by sitting down and wishing to become so. Well, absolutely. We become spiritual by maintaining our spiritual disciplines, even at this time of global upheaval and uncertainty. And if we do that, by keeping these things going, we shall positively flourish and bear fruit for the glory of God, some of which we may never see or hear about until we stand before him in that great day of triumph and celebration that is yet to come. So, dear friends, in the words of Paul, therefore encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. Amen.